Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF, here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody, my name's John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Julie Salamon, the author of Devil's Candy, a book about the making of an epic flop, Bonfire of the Vanities. It's a brilliant read. It's a classic of its kind. Julie has amazing access into what is a ringside seat, I guess, of what is one of the most infamous sort of failures in Hollywood. Julie was film critic at the Wall Street Journal and has written a whole bunch of books on a variety of subjects, not spreading from Christmas trees to movies. She's a New York Times bestseller, and we're really, really lucky to get her for this conversation. I really appreciate it. She's also got a podcast out, which is based on The Devil's Candy, which I will put a link to in the show notes, and I highly recommend anybody who enjoys this conversation, you will enjoy that podcast. Please remember, if you enjoy this podcast, please like, subscribe, write reviews, tell your friends, tweet about it, write Facebook posts if anybody still does that, and generally, yeah, that would be really, really useful, and I would be really, really grateful. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
Have my video. I wasn't hiding. I forgot to put it on.
No, I don't mind. Some people prefer to have it off, and so they can just sort of concentrate on talking other people. I don't know. I just keep it on as from force of habit. Even though every time I do, I wonder why. I think, I should have made the bed better.
That's okay. We're used to peeking into other people's bedrooms at this point.
Exactly, seeing their pets and all that sort of stuff. I've read your book very recently, so it's very, very, it's very fresh in my head now. And it fascinated me, this, because I saw Bonfire of the Vanities at the cinema in England, and I remember there being a sort of kerfuffle around it. I remember knowing something about it, but I saw it as it's because in the afterwards of your book, you sort of say nobody saw it without it being something, nobody could just watch it as a film. And I've got a feeling I did just watch it as a film,
Yeah, maybe I should have said nobody in the U.S. probably.
Right. Right. That was the what led you to sort of, I mean, did you choose the director or the film? How did you start on this project?
I started on this project really by choosing the idea of doing this kind of a book. You know, I'd been reviewing films for the Wall Street Journal for several years. I really wanted to write books. I'd written a novel, and I was interested in doing a nonfiction book similar to Picture, which was a book that Lillian Ross, a New Yorker writer, had written in the 1950s about a John Huston movie, The Red Badge of Courage. And I loved that book. I had read it right before I became a film critic. And I just thought it was so interesting about, you know, kind of what really happens on a film and just sort of the internal world of movies, of movie making. And I had actually been looking around for a director who'd let me do it for quite a few years. And I'd gotten to know De Palma through my work. And I must have mentioned this to him at some point. Then when Bonfire, when he got commissioned to do Bonfire, he asked me if I'd be interested in doing the book about that. And I told him I would, but I would do it completely without any interference from him or anybody else. And he said, great, you know, let's do it. I think he's a little bit of a troublemaker, a provocateur. And I think he thought it would be interesting to have a, you know, sort of an objective, as much as anybody can be objective, observer on the set. And so that's really how it started.
In a way, he's a perfect subject, because I can't imagine someone like Steven Spielberg giving anybody that amount of access.
Right. It's funny. I had approached Spielberg. I can't even. It was a film. One of his rare flops. Was it 1941? It was a film that I felt really lucky though, because it wasn't like a big exciting flop like Bonfire. It was just sort of a boring one. But you're right. I don't think he would have opened up that way. And also, De Palma's just a super interesting person, you know, because he has such a, you know, Spielberg, of course, is, whether you like or don't like, he's an amazing filmmaker, but very much in a Hollywood vein, whereas De Palma really is more of a street filmmaker who became a Hollywood filmmaker. And he turned out to be quite an interesting subject. Yeah, the funny thing was, though, when he called me up to tell me that I could follow him around, I was 6 months pregnant with my first kid. So the timing was not exactly the best, but I decided to just, you know, they started pre-production literally 6 weeks after my daughter was born. And I thought, you know what, I just have to figure out how to do this because it's such a rare opportunity.
And that sort of mirrors something in the book as well, because one of the producers is pregnant and sort of has to leave halfway through the book, right?
Yeah, in fact, pregnancy was sort of an unintended sub-theme there, because Melanie Griffith had just had a baby as well. She'd had a baby, I think, a month before I did, and she was back working. You know, at least I didn't have to wear a skimpy little dress. You know, she had, and I do think that added to a lot of the pressure on her. But even that was quite interesting, you know, that even though it's this glamorous business on the one hand, on the other hand, here's this, and Tom Hanks's wife was pregnant. I mean, I guess it's not that surprising. All of us were in our 30s and it was sort of what people were doing, having babies. But it is, now that you mention it, it's kind of bizarre.
There was something in the water.
Yeah, exactly.
I met Brian De Palma on one occasion. I was doing an interview for in Venice, in the film festival in Venice, with one of his later films, Obsession, I think it was. And he was quite a tricky interview subject, I have to say.
Yeah, he can be very grumpy if he wants to. Was he being very taciturn or provocative or what?
Yeah, well, it was a round table, which are not the best ways of conducting a conversation, because you often have two. Well, as you well know, you'll have perhaps 2 or 3 journalists who won't say anything and 2 or 3 who won't shut up. And, I asked him, I think I had one question, basically, 1 or 2 questions. And I asked him, oh, you're doing this film, you're releasing this film in Italy and you're premiering it in Italy, and this is the home of the giallo. So, you must feel good about that because it's, and he was like, I've never seen a giallo. What are gialli? And he said, Martin Scorsese talks about them all the time, but I don't understand, what are they? And I was just like, man, you're like, it's like, you might as well be saying, my name isn't Brian De Palma. My name's Tony or something,
Yeah. Although I have to say, he was brought up very waspy. His parents, he grew up, that's the thing that was also interesting to me about him when I first met him, because, I thought he was going to be like Scorsese or Coppola or some cliched version of the Italian director. And, it turns out that even though his parents were both from Italian families, they were definitely very much interested in assimilating. His father was a very prominent surgeon in Philadelphia, and he went to Quaker school, and he was brought up without any kind of Italian affect at all, even though obviously he did make, did he? No. Scarface was Cuban, now that I think of it. Yeah, so, it was... his name is Brian De Palma, but you're right, it might as well be Brian Smith or something, which is another interesting aspect of his personality.
The other sort of like serendipity that comes with this particular film, catching on this particular film on the ground floor, is because you're dealing with adaptation of a book by Tom Wolfe, and Tom Wolfe also being a journalist who is very much in that sort of new journalism sort of, and you start with him in chapter 1. It's Tom Wolfe right from the very beginning, but I noticed that you very much kept yourself out of the book.
Yeah, that was a big decision, and I just did a podcast series based on the book for Turner Classic Movies, which has gotten quite a good response, and it was an interesting experience because for the podcast series, I'm the writer and the narrator. So my story becomes part of it. And it was a discussion we had. And I think part of the reason I did it the way I did it was probably influenced by the Lillian Ross model, to do it, almost let it unfold like a novel. And I was the omniscient narrator. I've written several nonfiction books throughout my career, and I've sort of divided it up almost 50-50, and some I've got myself into it and some I haven't. And I think for this book, I wanted the reader to get immersed in the movie experience as though they're with me watching all of this stuff unfold. And, I saw it even in the podcast. Once I introduced myself into it, it changed it. Not to say it was bad. I think it was fun for that venture. But for this, I really wanted it to be, to not have me be in the middle of it. And even though Tom Wolfe has a very active and exuberant kind of voice, he never puts himself in his books, actually. They also unfold in that way. One thing the first draft of the book, I definitely did what I think anybody who's ever written anything related to Tom Wolfe, I started to try and mimic him. And that's just not a good idea, because if you're not Tom Wolfe, you shouldn't try to be Tom Wolfe. And so that was also very conscious to pull back from that. And so, but that was a conscious decision. Because I had gone back and forth with my editor which way to do it. And for this particular story, we thought this was more effective.
What was Tom's reaction to The Devil's Candy? Did he read the book and give you a critique?
Well, it's funny. I never heard from him right away, and I had 2 multi-hour sessions with him at the beginning and then towards the end. And after the movie had come out, I didn't hear from him, but then he called me several years later. His daughter was thinking about working for the Wall Street Journal, which is where I had been a film critic. And out of the blue, he called me up to talk to me about whether it was a good idea for her to do that. Was it a good place to work? And in the course of that conversation, he told me he liked the book so much. And then he actually gave me a blurb for one of my later books, which was really amazing. And then when he died, his daughter, who did go work for the Wall Street Journal, invited me to the memorial service for him. And when the podcast came out, she sent me an email just to tell me how much she liked it and how much her father liked my book. That The Devil's Candy had been, it was such a good feeling. It really made me, because I've always admired him so much. When I was starting in journalism, I'd read everything that he wrote. And, he was just sort of because he did start this whole different way of doing journalism. So he did like it, which made me feel really happy.
Yeah, because it must be a very dangerous feeling writing a book like this. That's so you're sort of entering into people's lives, and you're they're washing their laundry in front of you, so to speak. Were there any moments when you were sort of thinking, I'm not sure if I can put this in the book, it's a little bit too raw, or I'm going to get such and such in trouble with so and so, or anything like that?
Well, I would say the thing that caused me to have the most pause was the whole episode when Melanie Griffith showed back up on the set, having had breast enhancement in the middle of the movie. When it happened, I had this simultaneous feeling of, oh my God, this is great material. And this equally strong reaction thinking, I really wish she hadn't done that, because what do I do? As a woman, as, a quote unquote respectable journalist, I didn't want, because I knew once you put that in the book, it would be the headline,
right?
On a lot of stories, which it did become. But so I kind of just, I was doing this in real time, because the movie came out in 1990. My book came out a year later. So I was taking notes constantly and almost starting to write, at the same time, or at least map it out. So I just decided, don't even think about it. Just write everything down. I had to ask her about it, which was so embarrassing. I mean, I listen now to the tapes because I had to listen to them for the podcast, and you can hear I just sound embarrassed, which I was, because it's, pretty rude question. And so that was probably the most uncomfortable part. De Palma was so open about his private life. And towards the end, I asked him if there was anything that he could think of that he wouldn't want to be in the book. And it's really funny that even though he had told me all of these things, the only thing that he cared about was something minuscule that he thought would hurt the feelings of the woman he was then going out with. So I did take that one thing out. And that was the only thing that really came up. There was a lot of the people who were the below the line people, like Eric Schwab, who was the second unit director, who becomes sort of the star of the book in a lot of ways.
It's a hero, yeah.
The hero. And, he was such a great character and such a great guy, really. And also, I think, emblematic of a certain kind of person in Hollywood, somebody who's incredibly talented and incredibly smart, but probably not quite ruthless enough to get to the very top rung, So I loved his story. And, he talked quite openly to me about the woman he was going out with, who he ultimately did marry, and a lot of personal details. His father had died. I mean, all of these things. And it all ended up in the book. And when he first read the book, he was upset, not that it was wrong. It just, I think, embarrassed, or not even know, because, somebody like De Palma had been written about so many times, but somebody like Eric, this was new. And so it took me a long time to kind of calm him down. And then when the book came out and all the reviews pointed to him as, the hero of the story, I think he started to like it a lot more.
I think his role is amazing. And I love the way he's sort of like crafting these beautiful moments in the middle of this in the middle of this gargantuan film, which is slowly but surely going off the rails. So you're in the room with De Palma, and you're in the casting, the audition process. You're seeing Uma Thurman come in. I mean, and how do you make sure that you're just in the background? How is that? How do you avoid becoming sort of part of the story or changing?
It's surprisingly easy to be part of the background when you're dealing with people from Hollywood, because I shouldn't even just say that. That's mean, but it's also partly true. But I also think, but I think when you're an actor and you go for an audition, there's always a bunch of people sitting around who you don't know who they are. Brian would introduce me to people. Oh, this is Julie Salamon. She's writing a book about the movie. And people go, oh, yeah, whatever. But at the time, nobody was really paying any attention, and I was dressed very, like everybody else on the film set. I had a hoodie and a pair of jeans and my little clipboard. And there were always 5 other people with a clipboard. So I don't think it really registered with people what was happening. And, most people, there's a lot of young people. Most of them weren't reading the Wall Street Journal. And I don't think he identified me that way. He just said, this is Julie. She's writing a book about, and so I think for the stars, at first, they just didn't pay any attention. And then over time, I became kind of a fixture. And people would come over and start talking to me because, on a film set, there's so much downtime. It's so boring so much of the time. So I was always there, happy to hear their stories. And so it was actually incredibly easy to sort of hide in plain sight.
And in terms of those stars, you have some very different sort of, I mean, you really capture Tom Hanks as well in a moment when he's not quite become Tom Hanks of today. He's still sort of Turner and Hooch Tom Hanks.
Yes, Turner and Hooch. I mean, he had done Big. So he was Big and Turner and Hooch. But yes, it was before he'd become a big star, but he was definitely a star, but not at the magnitude. But he was really interesting in the way he handled himself. I think what you see is what you get with Tom Hanks. He's a decent person who's become far bigger a success now than he was then, but he was already a pretty big success for a young guy. And he just handled it. He was very mature, very careful. Not to say he was a saint or anything like that, but he was, he understood his role in the universe and didn't think he was a god or something like that. It was fun. I mean, all of us were around the same age in a way, and yet I felt I was invisible. For me, I felt like I felt like that, in Harry Potter where they had the invisibility cloak you put on. I mean, of course I wasn't. But it was this incredible experience, plus I was incredibly sleep deprived for most of it because, I'd go do this all day and then go home to my brand new baby and husband and try to remind them who I was. And so there was a lot going on, but Tom Hanks was just a very nice guy. One of the woman who was Brian De Palma's assistant at the time and ultimately became an associate producer on the movie. We caught up again recently for the podcast, and she was describing Tom Hanks. She said, he was great to work with because he'd hang out on the set with the crew. But if he didn't want to have people approach him or he wanted some private time, he just, absented himself in a way that was not a big deal, or he knew how to make it clear what the rules were without being a jerk about it.
Yeah, there's moments as well when sort of Melanie Griffiths is sort of flirting with him, and he sort of goes a bit stiff and sort of like, oh, yep, okay,
Yeah, I think she went and sat on his lap. Melanie was really interesting. I actually liked her, but she at that time, I should say, was definitely very complicated, and she would definitely get into these weird, very flirtatious mode where she would literally come out and like sit on somebody's lap, which, in my world, that was unusual behavior. And yeah, Tom Hanks would get very uncomfortable. I mean, he hadn't been married that long to his wife, who was 6 months pregnant. And I think the whole thing was just like, no, I don't think we want to actually do this right now, but always pretty nice. And, and he could be a little snarky sometimes. I think sometimes when he would see Bruce Willis on the monitor and, watching a shot, and, Bruce would have this smirk that became a little bit of a joke around the set, this one look that he had for different scenes. And Tom would make a few little wisecracks about it, nothing too mean, but just something that you thought, okay, he's not a saint.
Well, and of course, Bruce Willis sort of comes over. Reading the afterword and the sort of the nastiness that sort of resulted in after the publication of the book. Have you ever had any further dealings with him since that time?
I have not. I mean, his reaction to the book was so crazy. Given, you've read the book. Clearly he was somebody who it didn't come off that well, but he didn't come off that badly either. He didn't, he did his job. He showed up for work every day, and he was a little bit of a wise guy or, jerk sometimes, but not terrible. And he was so vicious about it afterwards. But I don't think it was the action. I think, yes, it was the content. But I also think, and I give De Palma a lot of credit for allowing me to do what I did, because I think for some people, that decision to allow a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, a critic and reporter on his set, was seen as an act of utter betrayal, like just letting somebody into your family gathering and write an expose without people really understanding what was happening. I shouldn't say expose, to write an in-depth observation of it.
Yeah, I think you were kind of very fair. You sort of, you mentioned his limited range, but he kind of does have a limited range. And you even sort of, you excuse his sort of having the bodyguard and everything because, he's quite insecure and he's got a lot of fans who, go too far. So I think you sort of gave quite an even-handed version. I mean, he's not the hero, but he's by no means the villain.
Exactly. And I just think, he, at that point in his life, he was constantly being surrounded by the paparazzi. He and Demi Moore were just sort of like magnets for that, but they were magnets for a reason. They provoked and prodded. I mean, Tom Hanks was not a magnet for the paparazzi. And I think some of it is, even today, where it's harder to hide because of social media, but there's definitely certain people who you see over and over and over again in these social media wars and all of this stuff. And why is that? If you don't engage, you don't get involved in it. And he engaged. And I will say, I think one of the things that he was used to doing was sort of charming reporters with his charm. And I think with me, it wasn't so easy to do that because I could see him. I could see him every day. I could see how he behaved with other cast members. And ironically, if he had been more forthcoming, I do think in retrospect, a lot of his, he would hide in his trailer, or he'd have a bodyguard, or he'd do all of these things. I think a lot of that was his own insecurity. I think he had a certain amount of insecurity about, he'd just come off of all these the Die Hard movie franchise that just started. And that was his big success. And he'd done Moonlighting, and he wanted to be seen as a serious actor. He'd actually been quite good in this movie, In Country, where he plays, I think, a Vietnam vet. He was really good in it. But I think that he saw my book as sort of tearing him down, or, and he hates journalists. I mean, that was the other thing. He just, he just hates journalists, period. He just thinks we're all scumbags. So it's hard to get past that.
There's not much you can do about that.
Yeah.
When you were going back a little bit, maybe to the audition of Uma Thurman, and we're talking about Melanie Griffith as well. Do you feel that, looking back at the book and at the time, do you feel that with the Me Too movement and with Harvey Weinstein and the revelations, that there's there were things there that you think, oh, well, hopefully that wouldn't happen anymore, or the way of talking about women, or do you think that a lot of that is largely unchanged?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sitting behind those closed doors. I would think that the way people talk about women would change. I will say that the group, I've thought about this a lot now with in light of the Me Too movement, that in the case of Uma and all the women being auditioned, in the audition room, at least when I was there was a lot of respect. I mean, Lynn Stallmaster, who was the casting director, he died a few years ago, but he was really such a gentle and nice person. And I think very, very respectful of the actors. And De Palma is very respectful of actors. Now, obviously I wasn't in the room. What was remarkable at that time was I was in the room when they were just talking about these women. I remember at the time, I mean, that was the very first, I can't even call it interview. That was the very first session I was allowed to observe. That's when I was still trying to decide whether to do this or not. As I said, I just had a baby. Was this the right moment to embark on this kind of a project? And that was the first thing I saw. And boy, when I sat there and heard them describing Uma Thurman that way, I thought, and Melanie Griffith, I thought, oh yeah, I want to do this, because I realized that I was having access to things that people just don't see. And it wasn't like it was criminal. I mean, this was not Harvey Weinstein and the casting couch, but it was almost not worse, but just more subtle. It's just this atmosphere. So like, why does Melanie Griffith go and sit on people's laps? I think at that time, especially, there was still this objectification of women. And why when you saw a lot of the things that the women were asked to do on that set, you thought, wow, I wonder if they would be asked to, or if they would accept doing those today. Not that women don't do plenty of sex scenes and things like that today, but it's different when you're in charge of that decision, or whether somebody's telling you to do it.
Yeah, the scene where she, the actress who is also Brian De Palma's girlfriend at that point, is photocopying her private parts, which is a funny scene. But the filming of that is, and her account of that filming is really, it's kind of moving, really, and it is a great argument for having. I'm not sure if what the right term for them, intimacy advisors on set. That's a really good argument for having that kind of figure there.
Absolutely, and at the time, Beth is a very intelligent woman, and who understood what was happening, but felt that, you want to work. And, at that point, what roles were available. And very, very interesting. I'm curious, when you saw the movie without having all this baggage that maybe Americans might have about the book, what was your reaction to the movie just as a movie back then?
Yeah, I think I remember really finding some of it really, really funny, and I loved that opening shot. And I rewatched the movie after I read your book as well, because I watched the film in the cinema, so it was 91, so it was a long time ago now. So I rewatched it, and I remember as I was rewatching it, I was thinking, oh God, yeah, I loved that bit when I first saw it. And the biggest laugh in the whole film for me is the guy telling the story to Bruce Willis about the airplane sticking the wing in and then coughing and dying. It's just such, and in a way that might be the sort of problem with the movie, is that kind of zanier sort of, it's a kind of cheap gag, cough, 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 die. But that was the thing that worked much better for me than the sort of the satire, the social sort of, but that also could have been partly my, what did I know about New York and race relations in 1990s Liverpool?
Well, yes, but I also think you're putting your finger on something because, people have always asked me, oh, when did you know the movie was a disaster? And I'll say, never, because when you watch those dailies, and when you watch the daily footage that was shot the day before, they always go over it to see how it looks. And, the movie's shot out of sequence, so you're not watching it in order. And it always looks great. De Palma's a very good director. He has a terrific visual style. So each scene individually looked great. And also you get inside the mindset of like, this is great, even as a writer, I've done that myself where I'll get so tied to a passage that I've written and think and fiddle around with it and think it's so wonderful and then show it to an editor and they'll go, redo that. Or what? Or this is overdone, or it doesn't fit. Maybe it's a great 2 paragraphs, but in the middle of this larger picture, it doesn't work. And so I know very well what it means to not necessarily see how something doesn't fit together. And yeah, I think your reaction to the movie, it still has its fans. Now after the podcast came out, I got a lot of letters and stuff from different people or emails, and many of them will say, oh yeah, I've always loved that movie. It's so great. I just think, because, and honestly, watching it now recently to prepare for the podcast, I thought, this movie is kind of fun. It's sort of, is it a great movie? I don't know. But compared to so many movies that you see, it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff. So even if it doesn't 100% work, it's kind of fun to watch. It's even if you just watch it to dissect it and figure out what would have been better. But I think they tried to cram too much into too short a space. It's just such a complex story that I can't imagine, especially for somebody like you who's not from the States, some of it must have just seemed a little baffling, didn't it? I would think. It must have just seemed like, what? What's happening? Whereas I think if it had unfolded under, like one of these Netflix series or something like that, there'd be more time to let people know who these people are popping up.
Well, absolutely. I'm watching Succession at the moment, and that's very New York, very much the same sort of social class. I don't feel I need to know much to enjoy it. It's still, it hits very hard and very, very well. So yeah, maybe that was. Have they ever talked about doing a mini series? Because I would have thought that would be a HBO Netflix sort of slam dunk.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny. The first person to actually suggest that, and it was way before there was Netflix or even HBO, was Tom Wolfe. When I interviewed him and I write about it in the book, this was before he saw the movie. He said, I don't know how they're going to do it. He said, in my mind, this should be like a series, like one slice after another, because unlike Succession, which I agree with you is somewhat similar in terms of the Masters of the Universe part of the story, but Succession doesn't really deal with all those other layers, the black-white relationships, the corrupt judicial system. So, it's sort of like Succession is one piece of it, and then there's all these other layers going on. And so Tom Wolfe himself felt that a few years ago, not that many years ago, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Amazon had said that they were going to do a serialization of Bonfire, the Vanities, and it's
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamor.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
still hasn't happened. And I think it would be terrific. You know, sort of a period piece of New York in the 80s. I think it would be really terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'd totally be down for that. I still haven't read the book as well. We got the book paperback upstairs, and I've read loads of Tom Wolfe as well. I've read the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and The Right Stuff. So yeah, I should read that before Amazon come out and with the series.
Yeah.
Was there ever a point when you were sort of following the film that you because so many things kind of go wrong, or there are problems about the courthouse, and you know, you get so into it. Are there ever moments where you're thinking this is terrible for the movie and it's terrible for Brian, but it's really good for the book?
Oh my God. Every day practically. I mean, the more things went, you know, and it's one of the dark sides of journalism, right? That when things are bad, it's good for your story. And so, yeah, I had that feeling all the time. Oh, this is great. This is great. More delays. Great. Oh, they're casting Morgan Freeman. Ridiculous. Great. Melanie Griffith's new breast. Oh, terrible. Great. So yeah, I had that feeling all the time. And you have to understand, you know, I had no idea how this was going to end up. I thought that the movie, honestly, I never thought the movie was going to be a big flop, but I had no idea if it was going to be a success or, like most movies, you know, okay. I guess in my mind, from a literary point of view, I thought it would end the way Picture did. The Red Badge of Courage came out. It wasn't a huge success. It wasn't a huge failure. And everybody went on to the next thing. And so I love that idea that all of this effort and all of this, you know, money and all of this worry went in and then on to the next one. So I think for me, I was just so intent on collecting as much information as I could, and then trying to, you know, it probably took several months before I fully realized who my main characters would be. You know, I mean, obviously I knew it would be the stars, and I knew it would be the director and the producer and the studio people, but among the supporting cast kind of people, or the secondary stars, it took a while to figure out who they would be. So I had to interview and take notes on everybody just to be sure, you know. So yeah, but yeah, definitely it's a terrible, it makes you feel like a terrible person because you are always the one rejoicing in other people's agony.
You do, I mean, as well as interviewing all the people as they're filming, I thought the post-production part was really interesting, where you go and you actually interview the people who are doing the Foley art, the Foley artist who's doing the clippity clop, and they use coconuts. I thought that was just a Monty Python thing. I didn't realize they actually used coconuts.
They actually do, and I have to say, it was so. I'm glad you like that part, because I'm I'm a movie nerd, I just love all that stuff, all the little details. And, frankly, just just seeing how the whole thing is put together, especially back then, again, doing this podcast was so interesting because it, revisiting a lot of this stuff 30 years later. So I spoke to the guy, Bill Pinkow, who had been the film editor. And, he reminded me that back then, they literally hung strips of film up. Like if you went into a film editing room, there would be dozens and dozens of strips hanging up like laundry. Just the technical precision of all of that just blew me away. I just thought, wow, this is incredible. And, for me, even though the book has come to be regarded as the anatomy of a flop or whatever, to me, what the book was always about and still is about is just the incredible machinery that goes into making a movie and the skill and the, just the talent at all these different levels, the craftsmanship. I mean, film editors, if you actually think about it, I mean, so much of how a movie turns out is up to the editor. They're the ones looking at these, this massive film that comes in and making the first cut usually, which is incredible. So that I just loved. I'm glad you appreciate. And the Foley artist, that to me was like, it was just, it's like being a kid again, like it was like, let's put on a play about coconuts. That was really magical.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of them says actually, every film deserves its own sound. It has to have its own, so they weren't taking sort of good enough for good enough. It had to be really, really good for everything. I thought that was amazing. And the whole idea of the editor having there's a slow motion scene of the sword fight using the sword of justice. And and they say, no, it's not working because it's slow motion. We have to do it normal speed. And they have to cut out every other frame to make it normal speed again.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so much work. And then, the irony is that all that work might not even be seen, might not even be appreciated.
Exactly. And it's amazing, like even now talking to a lot of the people, like this Bill Pankow, the editor, had worked with De Palma on several films before and after Bonfire. And, you can just hear in the way he talks about his work, the pride, as he should, that he takes in his work. And the other part I loved was just the fanaticism of all these guys. I mean, he would say that, his family was always furious at him because he was always going off someplace to work on a film. And, it's a brutally hard life. I think it's an incredibly exciting life when you're young. And I think after years and years of doing it, I mean, these movie crew people, when you see, you're in Italy, but, here on the streets of New York, there's always movie crews. And it's always so funny because it's all these self-important young people, clear the streets, go in. I thought, I live on this street. But, there's something very powerful and exciting about it. But it also takes a huge toll on people's lives. And it takes a very particular kind of person who wants to do that.
I love the film students who are sort of seconded in to sort of look after Brian De Palma, and they're all the couple of them are quite entitled. And so if I'm not going to be near the director, I'm going to go off and film a music video or something.
I know, they were hilarious. They were so funny. And that's the other thing, you could see the ones who were going to really possibly make it were the ones who were willing to do anything, like, you're absolutely, I love those guys. I mean, there were so many great characters on the set, because it does bring together such a crazy mishmash of people, from highly educated, highly rarefied types to real street types. And so that was also a lot of fun. And at that time, not so many women on the set. Most of the women were in very particular roles. Ann Roth, the costume designer, and then the script supervisor was a woman, and the woman who worked with Dave Grusin, but that, those, they had more traditional women's roles. There was one female PA. I mean,
Right.
that's changed quite a bit since then.
And there's also sort of like something intoxicating about this movie business, because even the judge who Brian De Palma is suddenly like, I'm going to be the Spencer Tracy.
I know, and he was great. I have to say that was Judge Roberts, who Tom Wolfe actually modeled. There's a judge in the book who's sort of this very righteous Moses-like character, and Tom Wolfe modeled him on this guy, Judge Roberts from the Bronx, who has one of those real old-style New York voices. The kind of voice you hardly hear anymore, except in old movies. And he came and auditioned to play himself, and he was fantastic. And, I was saying when we did the podcast, my only regret was I didn't tape it. I was at his audition, but I didn't tape it. I don't know why I didn't tape it. I should have, but it would have been so great to have his voice, because he really was wonderful. Yes. And here's this guy who is a pretty prominent judge in New York City, but the movies, everybody just gets gaga over it. It's crazy.
When you were watching the decisions being made, was there ever a point where you were sort of thinking almost like you'd if I was doing this, I wouldn't do that, and that would make a better movie? Was there any? Because having written reviews as well for the Wall Street Journal, and I write quite a few reviews myself, there's always a temptation to say, if I was directing this film, I would have cut this bit out and moved that over there. And did you have that moment?
I think I was trying to strain that thought process out of my head so that I could really be in that moment. But I would say some of the decisions where I had that thought weren't so much on aesthetic basis, but more pragmatic. So one of the huge issues that sounds absurd that became just a major cost overrun issue was finding a courthouse. Because of the way the schedules were set up, Morgan Freeman was, they made the Jewish judge into a Black judge. Morgan Freeman was going to play him. He had a very short time period. Bruce Willis. That was the other thing, all these scheduling things. So instead of filming it in this courthouse that Dick Silver, the production designer, had built out in LA on the soundstage, which is very easy and convenient, De Palma just became obsessed with finding this perfect courtroom. And I remember at the time, it went on for weeks, and it ran the budget up like a few $1 million. It was insane. I think it just became, I think we've all done that, when you just become fixated on something, even if it makes no sense. And I do remember in the middle of that thinking, does it really make a difference? But, also afraid to say anything because, like the Emperor's New Clothes. And then, of course, when you see the courtroom scene in the movie, it's just like a courtroom. It could have been, it's like really all of this effort and work, but the amount of work that went into finding that and manpower was, mind blowing. And again, it was one of those things I think, great, I'm writing this down. But on the other hand, I was thinking, wow, this feels crazy to me.
It's that thing of, because he's a perfectionist, De Palma, and then you watch Bonfire of the Vanities and you think, I don't see perfection here. The size of that sign looked fine. There was nothing, it didn't blow me away. The courthouse was okay. It wasn't like it's the best courthouse scene I've ever seen.
Yeah, no, and the funny thing with De Palma too, because what I love about his movies is that they're very, he's got this very luscious visual style, but he also, especially his earlier movies are kind of gritty and kind of streetwise and kind of funky. And I've always found that kind of interesting in his movies, this sort of combination of very glitzy, big budget filmmaking, but then he also has this other sort of streetwise side, and I felt Bonfire was sort of toggling between those instincts, sort of the street smart Brian and the fancy Untouchables, Mission Impossible Brian. So yeah, it is funny, but I can see how it happens. I just saw the Wes Anderson movie, which is just over the top. The French
Dispatch.
The French Dispatch, which is just incredible to look at. I mean, it's like insane. But at a certain point, you're thinking, how many more things are you going to stuff into this thing? You know, how many more people? And you do understand, though, how it does take on a life of its own.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it's like, I don't know. It's like that thing that when you decide to be radical, it's like, well, there's no end game here. As soon as you're radical, then you're just gonna go further and further. Or if you want hot food, spicy food, there's no point where spicy stops. It just gets hotter and hotter and hotter, you know.
Yeah, that's right. And I also think with De Palma at that point, you know, in retrospect, you know, I think he was struggling with wanting the movie to be authentic and yet trying to please the studio executives and trying to not worry about pleasing them and to be his own person. You know, it's there was a lot going on, I think, internally with him. And I don't think I appreciated it as much at that time. I mean, his previous movie, which I liked quite a lot, Casualties of War, which was just a beautiful but ravaging and movie that was, even he said it was impossible to watch because it was so sad and terribly sad. And so I feel he felt a lot of pressure to make this movie a big hit, but also equal pressure to not capitulate. And sometimes that kind of struggle doesn't lead to the best decision.
And when the film came out, you get a real sense of the pain that causes and how did that make you feel a bit strange as well as a journalist, in the sense that, you know, having written some of these reviews, did you sort of think, oh, I might have written something similar to that had I seen it without?
Absolutely. You know, I don't know. It was just like, wow, this is so, I was just thinking when at the time thinking, wow, why are people being so vicious? I mean, yes, I've written some snarky things, but some of these reviews were so vicious, you thought that De Palma had killed somebody's child. I mean, it was, and it became a pile-on, you know, It just became this thing where it just cascaded, and it was bizarre. It was bizarre how truly vicious, but yes, it did make me have those thoughts. And within the next 4 years, I stopped being a critic. I found it much harder to do criticism after seeing the production of the film, because you realize nobody's trying to commit murder here. They're trying to make a movie, and they're trying to make a good movie most of the time. It became harder to do that. And, you know, I always felt that to be a good critic, you can't be soft. You have to be, you know, fair, but also tell your readers how you felt and what you saw and what you think. And you can't really soft pedal it. And so after a few years, and I also think for me, the experience of writing the book and then getting reviewed myself, you know, in the States, I got all really good reviews. And in England, I got either fabulous reviews or really mean reviews. Even sometimes people who would write these reviews that if you took off the mean part seemed really good because they went into all this depth. And the British press was definitely much more pugnacious at the time. And so, you know, having experienced both a lot of praise, but also some pot shots, I thought, okay, that didn't feel good. And the other thing was probably more important for my decision to stop reviewing was I loved the process, as hard as that was and as crazy as it was. I did love the long haul of writing a book. And so I was lucky enough after that to keep getting good book contracts so I could do that and make a living at it, which is kind of amazing. And I always credit The Devil's Candy with giving me that chance because it really launched my career and that part of my career. So it was great.
Yeah, that's so interesting as well, though. That the film comes out and gets criticized, and your book comes out, and everybody's that. There's always a critic somewhere.
Yeah, but I have to say, my book basically got very good reviews, and it was a hard feeling sometimes because De Palma, even after the movie did so poorly at the box office and got such vicious reviews, he kind of went into hiding for a while. But I was just starting to write my book seriously, and I needed him. I needed to follow up on, there were a million questions, and he was incredible. I mean, he did not say, go away, I hope your book never comes out. He was so honorable, in continuing to participate in the process, which I really, to this day, can't believe what a really hard and honorable thing that was that he did. Because I think he took a lot of grief for my book in Hollywood. I do think a lot of people really were mad at him, much madder at him than at me. I'm just a journalist. They expect that of me. But, for him to do it, I think it was not a popular move among a lot of people.
You mean because he let you into the sausage factory?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It was seen as a betrayal.
Right.
Movie sets are very carefully guarded. So when he invited me in, he didn't tell the studio first, because I didn't have a book contract at first. I was doing this on spec. I still was working at the Journal, and I was going to into all the pre-production stuff for several months, and then wrote a proposal and sold the book to Houghton Mifflin. And we still, the filming was taking place in New York, so it was easy to kind of not tell the studio what was going on. Then when filming moved out to LA in June, and you have to have a pass to get on the lot, the jig was up. But at that point, I had been there for so long, they realized that they had to cooperate because it would be worse if they didn't.
I guess they'd been sort of making of books which were sort of more like puff pieces and stuff like that. So they were probably thinking that's what he's got you doing.
Yeah, but I think they kind of had an idea by that point, since they had been told. I think they were very nervous about it. I think the fact that I worked for the Wall Street Journal was a plus for them. I mean, they knew that, I was quote unquote respectable, but I think they were pretty shocked when the book came out. They were pretty shocked. I think they had no idea, and this was my first book. So it wasn't like somebody could say, oh, that's the kind of book she writes. So, they had no idea what kind of book it would be.
Do you think you'd ever get access like that again in terms of following a production?
No. I don't think anybody will for quite a while. Nobody has for 30 years.
I was thinking that maybe that's it. Maybe you have the Red Badge of Courage in 1950. You have your book in 1990. The next one's due in 2030.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, everybody has to die first.
There's the next Brian De Palma movie.
Yeah.
You going around killing people off so we can do another one.
Exactly.
Do you think that Bonfire the Vanities sort of finished De Palma in Hollywood? I mean, he went on to make some great movies. Mission Impossible, you mentioned. Carlito's Way, I think, is a great movie, although I don't think it was necessarily a huge hit or anything. But do you think sort of there's a bit where Steven Spielberg says if he makes Home Alone 2, he'll be dead. That's when you'll know. But when he makes Mission Impossible, you do get the feeling that he's going as a sort of director for hire. I'll do my thing, and then I'm out of here.
Well, I think the movie where he made that decision that you're talking about was Mission to Mars. So that came a few years after Mission Impossible. It was a director for hire thing. Brian is not a space person. And, it was a big movie. I think it was a difficult production. And I think the studio interview, the whole thing was such a nightmare. And by that point, that was almost 10 years after Bonfire. I think he just decided, why am I doing this? I'm 60 years. At that point, he was turning 60. He thought, if I make movies now, I just want to have fun. I don't want to deal with the studios. And so he's made a few movies since then, all financed in Europe, all much smaller budget, all quirky, all movies that have their following. And I think he's been much happier doing that. I think from the beginning, he always had this uneasy relationship with Hollywood. And I think his more personal movies that he made in his first few years, and I think Carlito's Way kind of echoed those movies, were, movies of passion. I think Casualties of War was like that. But his natural sensibility is dark. And I think not sort of the trend of Hollywood films over time, not fantasy, not Marvel comic books or whatever. And so, I hope that he looks on his career and says, that was a pretty great career. I've made some really memorable movies, of a wide variety, the Untouchables on sort of a more classic Hollywood vein, and Scarface, which is still a cult movie. And then his early thrillers, Dressed to Kill, and all of those, Obsession, those are all really, really good movies. And, how many directors become Steven Spielberg, he's it, and most directors have a handful of movies that you really remember, or they're people like Wes Anderson, who really is a very particular vision of the world, and very charming if you like it, not annoying if you don't, but it's very personal, and he has stuck to that. Brian was always tempted by Hollywood because he had the ability, he wanted to see if he could do it. He's competitive, he's from a competitive family, and one of the things that I loved discovering and writing about in the book, it's in a way kind of a biography of De Palma and his family, and the things that motivated him to go into filmmaking. But I think, yes, I think Bonfire, I think whether or not Bonfire had been a success, I think he would not have stayed a Hollywood director for much longer anyway. I just think that he would have wanted to do things that weren't as, it's exhausting doing these huge budget, unless you're somebody like Steven Spielberg or I did a profile of Spielberg once when I spent a week with him, and then again saw him he enjoys the process. He likes the process. He finds it invigorating. Brian does not like the process. He likes dreaming up movies. He likes thinking about it, but the execution, he doesn't like being around a lot of people, which is what you have to do when you're on a movie set. His happiest day is like being alone in his room, reading or thinking. So he has a funny personality for a very successful film director.
Absolutely. I love the bit at the end of the movie when they wrap it and they all say, "Good morning, Brian," when he comes on the set.
Yeah.
And sort of joke with him about the fact he's sort of like not a very socially adept person.
Exactly.
Listen, Julie, thanks so much for talking to me. There's one last question I have to ask, though, which is, what film book would you recommend for our listeners? Because we always have tried to leave the listeners, obviously The Devil's Candy they're going to run out and buy now if they haven't already read it, but what film book would you recommend?
Well, I have to say, one of my favorite books about film were actually books of film criticism written by James Agee, who is a wonderful American author. And if you like old movies, reading his criticism is like reading great literature about the movies. So I would highly recommend the James Agee books about film. But the other book, more modern, that I just really loved was, what was it called? The Mark Harris book, Pictures at a Revolution.
Mark Harris has been on the podcast.
He's great. And I loved that book. I just thought it was so smart and so well done. You know, I've given you 2, but I'll give you a third one too. I loved the Chinatown book too by Sam Wasson. That was an excellent book about Chinatown. You know, I guess the books that I've liked most are where people take, you know, it's about the movie, but it's about the larger sort of sociological forces of it. And in the case of the O'Hara's book, it was also looking at history in a different way, which was really quite wonderful. And he's a great writer. And Sam Wasson, also a very good writer. So,
I mean, even when you're reading The Devil's Candy, you know, now rather than sort of in 92 when it came out, 92, 93 it came out, you are reading about the early 90s and the tail end of the 80s. So it also has that historical sort of, even though it's not a, you know, I guess everything becomes historical.
Right. If it's old enough, it becomes historical. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, listen, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
We actually talked for a few more minutes, and some of this conversation is quite fun, so I'm going to include it here. So this is the reason what Julie's talking about now is that I listened to The Devil's Candy, the audio book that she did, and so I was curious about the process of doing that. So that's how we ended up talking a little bit longer.
Cantor, somebody commissioned it and asked me if I wanted to read, so I auditioned, and it was so hard reading that book.
How long does it take? Because I always wonder about, you know,
my God,
how long to record an audio book.
It took a week. It took a whole week.
Oh, right. Okay.
It was, you know, you have a director. Well, now because of COVID, normally you would have a director right there in the studio, but I was in a studio. You know, you have to wear the mask to get to the studio, and then they lock me in this booth, and the sound engineer was out there, and then they had a computer with the director up there, and she was actually really helpful, you know, would tell you to liven it up or repeat that or whatever, and then you have to go back and do retakes. It was really, but it was fun. It was, you know, my audio gear.
I occasionally do contributions to The Economist. They have a podcast, The Intelligence. So I do, you know, talk about Dune for 5 minutes or something. And it is funny because what they do is they sort of interview you and then take the questions out.
Oh, that's funny.
So when you listen to it back, I'm so amazed. Wow, I sound so confident, but I'm actually replying to somebody. I'm not just like thinking it up.
Right. Well, that's funny because I just did an interview for who was it, for Viacom, or they're doing some kind of documentary about Tom Hanks. And what they do for those, it's very similar, but they'll ask you a question and then they say, and when you answer the question, repeat the question. So, was this the moment that Tom Hanks broke through into movies? And then you answer the question. So yeah, it makes you sound very professorial.
Yes. Which no, it's great. Oh, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Julie.
You too. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward. I saw that you had interviewed Mark Harris. I want to listen to that. I like him a lot. He's great.
Oh yeah, and Sam Wasson for The Big Goodbye, for the China.
Yeah. Oh, good. So I'll pitch your show. Yeah, I thought that book was quite good.
Yeah. I'm reading Glenn Frankel's book at the moment.
Do you like it?
The Midnight Cowboy one I really like, yeah. And on the back of that, he's done one on The Searchers and one on High Noon. So I sort of ordered them and I've started The Searchers one. And have you read The Searchers one?
No, is it good?
It's really interesting because it's like basically 150, 200 pages is just on the history of that. It's based on a true story. It's based on the film The Searchers was based on a true thing. So he tells that history and then leads it up to then John Wayne and it sort of, so it becomes a through line that all those things are connected.
So that young woman had been kidnapped and raised by a Native American family.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think he's a very good writer. Glenn Frink.
Yeah, absolutely. No, he's really good, and I've got him coming on in a couple of weeks as well.
Oh yeah, I think I did a blurb for his book.
No, well, yeah, you did, yeah. Because I read your name off there, and that's where I thought, I've got to get her on for
that's
for
funny,
the podcast as well.
Yeah, no, he's really good. I thought that Midnight Cowboy, well, that movie, when I read his book in manuscript, we watched Midnight Cowboy again. Boy, that movie holds up.
I haven't seen it for ages, and I've just finished his book, so I'm going to rewatch it.
Oh, you definitely should. And Chinatown also really holds up.
Oh yeah, Chinatown is
the best.
For some reason, Midnight Cowboy is a film I've watched once, and it must have been 20 years ago.
Well, it's so depressing. It's sort of hard to say, oh, gee, I just want to get depressed for 2 hours, but it's so good.
The funny thing is, there's a bit of music that John Barry writes in. I think it's when they go to Florida.
Yeah.
They used that on a BBC children's program.
Oh God.
In the 80s.
That's really funny.
So when I saw the film, I was like, and it's like, why are they using the children's program?
That's really crazy. Funny.
And who in the BBC went, I'm going to get that, that movie about the male prostitute? That's going to be the thing we're going to use.
Hey, boys and girls.
Exactly, yeah.
That's funny. Okay. Well, very nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
So that was my conversation with Julie. It was brilliant. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. Her recommended books were several. There was James Agee, film criticism, so a classic writer on classic film, which I tell you the truth, that's a name I've heard a lot, and it's someone I'm ashamed to say that's a bit of a hole, so I'm going to have to rectify that, inspired by Julie's enthusiasm. And she also chose Mark Harris, who of course, we did an episode about his biography of Mike Nichols. And we also talked about Pictures from a Revolution. Scenes from a Revolution is the name of the UK edition. So if you want to go back and listen to that, you can. But Mark Harris's book, Pictures from the Revolution, is absolutely brilliant. And I totally reaffirm Julie's recommendation, even though that's obviously not necessary. Right, I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. And I hope you're enjoying these podcasts in general. Please let me know if there are any suggestions that you have for writers that I should interview, any suggestions you should have generally. How's the sound quality? Is it okay? Is it listenable? Is there anything annoying? Is there any verbal tics? Do I say absolutely too much when I reply to people? Now that I've said it, you'll notice it and it'll annoy you. I'm sorry about that. Nothing left to say really, except thank you to Elliot Atkins for the music, and thank you to Ali Harwood for the art, and thank you to everybody for listening. Take care.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.